So, could you brief us on the concept of artificial reefs you're working on and how it helps the ecosystem?
Okay, so to understand how artificial reefs are helpful, I think it would make sense to understand how corals grow in the first place and how reefs are formed. So I don't know how much you and your audience already knows about coral reefs and coral reef biology, but to give you sort of a quick intro, corals are not rocks. They're not plants. They're very much living animals. So they usually tend to grow upon each other. So similarly to how for a forest to grow you need soil. For a plant to grow you need soil. Corals tend to grow upon their own exoskeleton that they sort of deposit, which is mostly made out of calcium carbonate. Now, the reason why we even need artificial reefs today is because most of our coral reefs, at least in mainland India, have been almost entirely destroyed. So the reason behind this is there are so many sort of contributing factors behind this. So one is the fact that there is, of course, large-scale climate change. These are sort of global scale events that we can't really sort of control sitting at home. And which impact corals because as rising ocean temperatures are happening across the globe today, where corals can usually they can survive in warm waters, and it's normal for every summer for water temperatures to increase, and that's completely normal. And usually what happens in reaction to increasing water temperature is that the algae that live within the coral body structure it tends to get ejected out of the coral body. Now these algae, they're called zooxanthellae, and they specifically live within coral bodies only, and certain other species of marine invertebrates. They are the ones that are responsible for the color of a coral reef. So all the pictures you would have seen, or if someone has gone snorkeling or diving and seen beautiful, colorful coral reefs, this algae is what is responsible for that color. So when this algae gets ejected out of the coral body is when it looks ghostly white. That's what you call coral bleaching. It looks completely white and bleached. So the reason why this is so bad is that it usually, again, it's a seasonal thing, and corals can survive for a short period of time without the algae. But now the algae have the ability to photosynthesize, right? So that means they contribute to a large percentage of a coral's nutrition. So for a certain period of time, the corals will still be able to survive without the algae. They can they do tend to filter feed and things like that. But over a period of time, beyond a certain period of time, they can't survive without that algae. And that's when they tend to die, and they start getting taken over by other organisms in that marine environment. And once that happens, the coral pieces tend to break off. They're just dead, and they get really, really brittle, and they tend to break off. And this is one of the main reasons why coral reefs are threatened across the globe. Now in India, we have a unique situation where we're a tropical country, so of course coral bleaching is a big issue in different parts of our country. And climate change, of course, is a big issue for a variety of reasons, right? And we also have a huge coastline, and a lot of people who are dependent on the coastlines and the ocean for their livelihood. So India is a huge exporter of seafood. So we're not just people who are eating seafood ourselves for our own families and communities and people within the country, but we're also exporting a lot of it. So because of this, the fact that we're part of this massive globalized food economy today, we are also exploiting our marine resources to a really, really high extent, more than we did probably 30 or 40 years ago. So in order to sort of feed that demand, we're exporting seafood to Europe, we're exporting seafood to North America, we're exporting seafood to parts of Hong Kong. In order to feed into that, we end up overfishing all our marine resources. Now, most of you guys, you're all IIT students, so I don't think I need to explain this in too much detail. But the reason why overfishing affects coral reefs as well is that it's all part of a food web, right? So it's not just corals that survive on their own without the help of fish, but fish are a very, very important part of a healthy coral reef ecosystem. like I mentioned this earlier, just as an example, there are a lot of species that tend to eat the algae, the turf algae that grows outside the coral reef bodies. You know, there's different types of algae, not just the ones that live within the coral. So they eat this algae, and that prevents the corals from being taken over by other species of algae. Now, with a lack of fish like that, you are going to have other animals and plants competing with corals for that very space that they're living in. So it sort of throws the coral reef ecosystem out of balance. Now, that's where artificial reefs tend to come in. You know, it's overfished waters, coral reefs that have been decimated over a very long period of time. So corals, newer, younger corals that are trying to sort of still survive despite the odds are not able to because they don't have a substrate. A substrate is basically a platform upon which a coral can grow. To give you a very, very quick introduction of coral reef reproduction, they basically, once a coral embryo is formed, it's floating freely as plankton in the water, and it tends to keep floating until it finds a suitable surface for it to settle upon and then grow. You know, it's similar to how you have plants, and a lot of the seeds are sort of floating around, right? You see some plant like drumstick seeds and stuff which are able to sort of fly around in the wind, and when they come into contact with a surface, with soil that is useful for them and actually conducive for them to germinate, is when they will actually germinate. So similarly, coral polyps are sort of floating around in the water column until they find a suitable substrate. And it is this lack of substrate that we're trying to address by using artificial reefs. If the seabed is only sand and there's no previously existing coral because it's all been destroyed, that's the issue that artificial reefs tend to sort of fix. Right, so they provide that platform, they provide that substrate, they provide an area on which corals can sort of regrow. And it's also important to keep in mind, we're not just looking at corals. Corals are one part of a very, very, very complex food system and a very complex food web. So along with corals, you also have other kinds of invertebrates. You have clams, you have different kinds of mollusks, you have tunicates, ascidians, sponges, so many different types of animals that form just the bottom of your reef. And once that happens, along with that, you also have fish that slowly start taking over that reef because it's such a safe place for them to hide. There's such a safe place for them to lay their eggs, and it's a good breeding ground for them. It's a good hunting ground for predatory fish. So in a sense, what we're doing to really simplify it would be like we're building sort of apartment complexes for the marine ecosystem.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer, ma'am. I mean, it was insightful actually because moving on to the next question. Given that Tamil Nadu has a long coastline, what are the possible ways to improve the citizen science on marine species?
That's a really, really lovely question, actually. So, as you said, yeah, Tamil Nadu has a very long coastline. We have a lot of cities, major cities like Chennai that are along this coastline. And it's very important to involve citizens, it's very important to involve students like yourself in exploring what is in our coastlines. So India is sort of slowly moving towards, and especially our student community with student groups such as Hope for Planet Earth and all, you guys are slowly moving towards that feeling of environmental responsibility, that feeling of the want for environmental justice. But there's we still have a little way to go to get to the part where we know enough to want to protect our oceans as well. A big sort of I want to say obstacle for people to explore the oceans is that not many people are comfortable getting into the water. Not many people can swim. Of course, in India, we're very scared of the ocean, right? We might go and swim in our pools, but we won't swim in the ocean because we're scared we'll drown or something like that. Which I was like that too. You know, when I was younger, I grew up in Chennai, but my mom would always say, don't go into the ocean, just stand by the beach. But even just that, you know, we don't have to force people, and that is, I think, the next step. But right now we can engage our citizens and our students with the coastline itself. We don't have to get all the way into the ocean, but even the beach ecosystem is a very beautiful, lively, exciting ecosystem for people to explore. We have a lot of sandy beaches in Chennai. We have a few rocky patches of our beach in Kovalam. We have a lot of beautiful biodiversity hotspots in Tamil Nadu itself, which we can slowly start exploring. A great example is the marine life of Mumbai, right? So they are basically a citizen science initiative. They're not all biologists, they're not all scientists, but they just started exploring the life at the coast. They were not talking majorly about conservation in the beginning. They were just introducing people to life on the coast and what kind of animals live on our coast. And I think that's a great idea to bring to places like Chennai and other parts of coastal cities in Tamil Nadu as well.
I mean, it would be really wonderful to have that one because as a student in Chennai, even like I could even like go around in the weekend to have some insight and something like that, ma'am.
Yeah, exactly. And beaches are free, right? You don't have to pay a national park fee to go to your beach that's close by. So it's a very easy way to and free resource for everyone to actually learn so much.
True, ma'am. Very true. Uh, okay, so the next question we have is there a need for an ocean exclusive policy in India for climate change mitigation?
So I actually remember seeing this question when you sent it to me yesterday, and I was thinking like, wow, you guys are asking me questions for which I have to like sit and study for. I'm not really a policy expert, or I have very limited knowledge about policy and policy making. So I don't think I would be the best person to sort of answer this question to be able to give you justice to the kind of questions you're asking for.
Uh, so I'll move on to the next question then, ma'am. So, what are the small things that we do daily, consciously or unconsciously, that affect the seas and the ocean lives out there?
So this sort of ties into what I was talking about earlier with large scale global events, right? Like we all think things like climate change is not something that we are directly impacting because like how can we as a person possibly be responsible for the entire climate of the entire planet changing? You know, it's a huge responsibility for any individual, and it's not really an individual's responsibility alone, right? So these kinds of things, large scale events such as climate change, are not the responsibility of only you and me. It is also a responsibility in addition to large scale corporations that are contributing to massive emissions, large scale governmental projects that are contributing to large scale emissions. So as citizens, we need to also, and students, we also need to be bold enough to ask the right questions. So that is also a really important part of how we are contributing to whether the good or the bad of the oceans, right? And secondly, of course, I don't think I need to talk very in detail about plastic pollution and things like that because your previous speaker was addressing that in a very concise manner as well. So to briefly touch upon, of course, plastic pollution is something that we are directly impacting, right? So our actions are directly causing marine pollution in our own beaches. You walk in any beach of Chennai, you'll see tons of plastic and you think that's not ending up in the ocean. I've seen it and I can tell you for a fact that it is. But it's not, again, it's both individual effort as well as putting pressure on large corporations. Like you and I will stop using plastic bottles, we can stop using plastic bags, we can shift to menstrual cups. And that's important and required and necessary. But at the same time, I think it's also important that we put pressure on companies which are selling us every product that we buy in a market that's in plastic. Like I want to eat chips, I want to have rice, I want to buy vegetables, I want to buy clothes. Everything is coming in plastic. Even clothes today are made out of polyester, not really cotton. So it is also up to us as consumers to put that pressure on companies because we're voting for a product, right? We're voting for a company with everything that we buy in the market. So we have that power that we sort of need to tap into and actually utilize.
That's a great message conveyed because apart from following the measures every day, we must also uh, I mean, as citizens and customers, we have the right to vote out. I hope
Exactly, right? Yeah.
yes, ma'am. I hope everyone gets the message.
So do I.
And so the next question we have is the sea level rise that we currently have. What are the thoughts and opinions that you have on the global scenario of the current sea level rises and changes in the sea or ocean rise?
So I like this is something that I feel like not many people are really understanding the impacts of, because it's not really affecting us, right? Most of the people who we speak to on a daily basis are from big cities or smaller towns. Not really people who are coming from places like Lakshadweep, Andamans, smaller islands that are really, really impacted by sea level rise. Now, on a global scale, this is not only resulting in us losing out on a lot of habitats, but it's also causing a really, really big human rights issue, because there are a lot of countries like the Philippines, for example, a lot of islands along the Pacific Ocean, where there's a crisis of climate refugees, where people are having to move out of their hometowns, of their home villages, from their homes essentially, and go to other places as refugees, not because of war, not because of things that people within their own countries and their own cities are doing, but because of larger people like us sitting in cities contributing to large scale emissions that is giving rise to sea level, that is resulting in sea level rising, which is in effect causing people to lose their own homes, right? So it's not just a question of we're losing out on habitats, but we also need to think about the human aspect of it, the human rights aspect of it, the fact that there'll be more and more refugees tomorrow, and that will be a crisis. It's not really it's not a few countable people or some couple of villages displaced, even though that's big enough to be an issue. It will become a really, really big humanitarian crisis within our own lives.
I mean, that's the worst thing that anyone can have to face, because either being it a, I mean, refugees as in is it's a bad thing. As you said, it's a humanitarian problem, and I hope again, I really hope everyone gets the message.
Yeah.
So the next question we have is, how important and vital is the contribution of fishermen for marine conservation and marine ecosystem?
It's extremely vital. It's part of the central aspect of it, right? Because nobody interacts with the ocean as much as fishermen do, and we often tend to look at fishermen, especially people who are from cities, tend to look at fishermen as they are the ones doing the overfishing. They are the ones that are causing the problem. Why are you fishing? Why are you throwing out your nets in the ocean? Ghost nets are a problem. Yes, these are issues, but one thing we need to remember is that they are a very integral and important part of a very, very big system, of which we are also an integral and important part. As consumers of seafood, even if we're not eating seafood, we are also sort of a part of the problem. So it's very vital that we shift from that narrative of blaming fishermen as the cause of marine destruction, but rather have them as ambassadors for marine conservation. Now, there are so many projects across the world where fishermen are taking an active role in conserving the reefs around which they fish and the reefs around which they live. Not just because they have that connection to the ocean, but also it simply makes a lot of economic sense, right? If something is providing you your bread and butter, you are likely to want to save it. But also we have to remember that they are faced with a lot of other pressures. It's not really a question of, I don't care about the fish and so I'm going to fish. It's really a question of, I need to be able to continue my job, feed my family. So they play a very, very important role in marine conservation as well, because they have an interest in protecting marine life. And that's something that we really need to recognize and appreciate.
This, I don't know, it just struck my mind. There's this book called The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. So that's one of the most beautiful books I've read, and I think I would I would want to like mention the book, because it's just one way to honor the fishermen out there.
Mm-hmm. I've not read the book, so now with your recommendation, I'm definitely going to go and read this book now.
It was one of the books that my English teacher had suggested during my sixth grade, I guess. It's a very small book, yes, ma'am, but it's a very, very beautiful book.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna go and find an online copy or something and get my hands on this book.
Yes, ma'am. The next question we have is, can you elaborate on the marine plastic pollution due to the COVID-19 crisis in India?
Yeah, so again a very pertinent question, considering the fact that everyone needs to use a mask now, and a lot of the safer masks out there, or the triple layer masks are use and throw. I think one thing we need to keep in mind is we're in the middle of a global health crisis. So it is understandable in a lot of situations where people are using use and throw right now, because they're in a situation where, it's either do I pollute the ocean or do I make sure I don't get sick. And it's one of those rare situations that I'm like, you know what, it's okay, but as much as we can, let's also try to use cloth masks. But at the same time, it's very important to sit and analyze whether this is actually the safest thing to do. Right now, safety is a priority, right? We cannot go and say, a policeman or a municipality worker who's cleaning our streets, or a doctor or a nurse should not be wearing, a plastic mask because it's polluting the ocean, because they are the ones that are facing the virus, honestly, a lot more than most of us who are sitting at home right now. So I think, why people like us who don't need to be outside all the time, who are not frontline workers, who are not exposed as much to the virus, can probably make that compromise and say, I'll use a reusable triple layer mask, which is taking care of my safety, but is also, making sure we're not polluting the oceans.
Yes, ma'am. The next question we have is, could you share with us a shocking or a mind-blowing fact that you came to know about while researching on marine life?
I don't have any shocking facts, unfortunately. But I think it's like, people think, no, if you're a marine biologist, you're seeing all these cool animals, and you get to, you see definitely some amazing things. But to be honest, I've not seen your amazing, whale sharks and things like that in the ocean ever. I've not seen those extremely dugongs and those rare animals. But one very exciting thing that I learned was that you all know clownfish, right? Nemo.
Yes.
So they that they live around anemones, and there's different species, and they usually tend to live in groups. And they have this phenomenon, they tend to live in groups, and they have a phenomenon where they change their sex. So if I'm not mistaken, and I might be, I'm not entirely 100% sure of whether they shift from male to female, but I think the head of the dominant member of each group is a female, and then once she dies, the next dominant member becomes a female. So they actually have a natural sex change throughout their lifetime itself. And it's not really set in stone, which is pretty interesting to think about.
Oh, so it's more like a male fish becomes a female head.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, they undergo a hormonal change that allows them to change their sex entirely.
That's a really interesting fact, ma'am.
Yeah. But I'm not sure if it's male to female or female to male, because it's a phenomenon that's seen in many species. Some change from male to female and some change from female to male. But that concept exists a lot in the marine kingdom, which is very, very shocking, if that's what you know.
That's actually beautiful as well.
Yeah.
So the next question we have is, trawler fishing has been having a significant negative impact on the marine life, especially in TN. How do you think we can improve on this?
So this is again where policy comes into the framework, right? Again, I'm not a policy expert, but in Tamil Nadu, we do have a ruling that says that they basically zoned our marine resources and said that 3.5 nautical miles from the coast, which is around 7 kilometers from the coast, is where only small scale fishermen can fish. So those are small motorized and non-motorized boats with smaller nets, which have a much lesser impact because their nets don't reach all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. And beyond this 7 kilometer boundary is where trawlers can go and fish. So that was sort of the government's way of ensuring that the fishermen who can fish close by the shore get more of an access to what is accessible to them. Because remember, if you have a small boat, you can't go 10 kilometers away from the coast, right? It's impossible. So if these guys get certain rights of access to parts of the ocean which are closer to them, which is easy for them to and feasible for them to access. A and B, this because of the methods of fish catch that they don't have nets that reach all the way down to the bottom floor. They have different types of catching methods. They're seen as slightly more sustainable than trawling. So they want to ensure that the ecosystems that are closer to the coast, and typically you have your corals and seagrass ecosystems slightly closer to the coast. It's not set in stone. It's not like beyond 7 kilometers you're not finding corals. That's not true at all. But generally they're trying to make sure that, okay, the more vulnerable and shallow ecosystems close to coast are slightly protected from more destructive methods of fishing like trawlers. Now, of course, there's always a difference between policy and how good a policy is and how well it's implemented, because very often it's not perfectly implemented. You have trawlers that come into the zones where small scale fishermen are supposed to be fishing as well, you know. So that's sort of the challenge, is to make sure that whatever policies you have towards sustainable fishing, whatever policies you have towards marine conservation are actually implemented in the ground as well.
Makes sense, ma'am. Makes sense. So, how can the benefits of tourism to marine ecosystem be maximized while minimizing negative impacts?
So to actually really analyze that, right, we need to understand first what are the positive impacts of tourism and what are the negative impacts. A lot of people tend to think that, hey, you know, the best thing we can do for a reef is we stop fishing and we convert all of those fishermen into tourism guides, and great, you know, problem solved. Then protecting the ocean, you're getting a lot of money, and great, you know. But of course it's so oversimplified, and that's not really how it needs to be done, or it should be done, or even though that's pretty much what is you know, marketed as a great conservation success story. We need to keep in mind that tourism also has its limits. You know, fishing is not unsustainable as it is, only if it goes beyond a certain capacity called the carrying capacity, which is the limit up to which you should be fishing. Only when it goes beyond that, catches way more fish, and it becomes overfishing, is when it becomes sustainable, right? So tourism is the same thing. If it's a small scale, few enterprises, that's fine, and that could be done in a sustainable manner. But very often, the people who invest in tourism are not very often localites. They come from either people from abroad, or they come from bigger cities. They have a lot more power in that sense. You know, they're not really local small scale fishermen at all. They are usually people who come from larger towns and cities who set up shop. I'm not saying that's particularly wrong, but what I'm trying to say is we need to have a tourism model where you are actually giving an alternative career to the local communities. And that does not mean just hiring them for few jobs. It means that they need to be in charge of the situation there, right? You cannot expect change unless you are actually inclusive about that change. You can't bring in someone from Delhi to a place in Tamil Nadu or a place in the Andamans and then expect them to actually be sensitive to the needs of the local communities there. Because they're coming from a different context, they're coming from a different place, they're coming from a different position of power and privilege entirely. So we need to understand that in order to have tourism remain sustainable, it needs to involve local stakeholders in a much more real way than what is being done today. If you look at the Andamans now, it was called, you know, there is a marine national park as well over there. It's a beautiful place. However, there was, you know, most of the tourism there is being done in such a large scale that there are parts of the reef that are being damaged primarily due to tourism. There is increased pollution, increased organic and plastic pollution that was never there before tourism started. Intensive diving in very, very certain areas of the island, which were tourists were frequenting more, which led to that area being degraded. So we need to keep in mind that it needs to be inclusive, and it really does need to be small scale for it to actually be beneficial from a conservation perspective.
Got it, ma'am. I mean, inclusivity actually has a lot of it has a lot of impact, and also it's a very huge factor in the role of a lot of things that concern tourism and everything. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
definitely.
the next question we have is one of the pre-final questions now.
Mm.
So, how will marine ecosystems and species adapt and respond to the individual and interactive effects of ocean acidification, anoxia, and warming? And to what extent is mitigation possible?
Okay, this is a long answer. So, I don't know how many people actually know what ocean acidification is because it's very technically explained most of the time. So, I'll try to sort of simplify it as much as possible so that it's not doesn't sound boring mostly.
Yes,
So,
ma'am.
basically what is happening right now is because of increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Why is that happening? Greenhouse gas emissions, right? We're burning fossil fuels. We are having, due to multiple reasons, and that is one of the major causes behind climate change in the first place. So now with increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have to remember that 70% of the Earth's surface is just oceans. So it's not that the air and the water are separate. These two are very interactive spheres, right? Your atmosphere and your hydrosphere are constantly interacting with each other. The surface of the ocean is in contact with air. Now, with increased amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it tends to sort of increase the acidification of the water, because what happens is when carbon dioxide reacts with salts that are naturally found in the water, they tend to form carbonic acid. Now, why is this an issue? In lab studies that have been conducted around the world, they have found that decreased pH of the water, which means it's becoming more acidic, negatively affects the ability of corals to deposit calcium carbonate and form that entire reef. And it's not just corals that require calcium carbonate, right? It is clams, it is any mollusk, any animal with a shell, that shell is calcium carbonate. So all of these animals are negatively impacted because the water is becoming too acidic, and so they're slowly getting corroded, and if not corroded, they're not able to accumulate that calcium carbonate upon the reef structure at the rate at which they need to be. Now, this negatively impacts the reef structure in general, as well as it has impacts upon the individual body chemistry and biology of the animals that are already living there. So, your question had multiple parts, so I'm trying to sort of address it. So, you might have to repeat that question for me. So that is essentially how animals and plants are negatively impacted by ocean acidification. Climate change and global warming is stuff that I've already sort of addressed. To what extent is mitigation possible? See, these sort of projects like the ones I do with restoring marine habitats, like putting down artificial reefs, a lot of projects in India are now transplanting coral as well. There are projects that are trying to look at different types of technologies to be able to successfully transplant coral and ensure that they're growing even faster than usual. But all of that is only useful if we're not, if we're to an extent, right? It's useful on a regional and local level. But if your problem, if your source is still remaining, then we are stuck. You can build all the artificial reefs in the world, but if you're not going to stop the source of destruction, how is that going to change anything, right? It's like saying I'll cut down half of India's forests, but then I will grow forests in a small part. I'll grow back probably 10%, and I'm patting myself on the back saying, look, I'm doing restoration. But really the problem is deforestation, right? The problem is destruction of our natural habitats because of climate change. But if we don't address climate change, if we don't address overfishing, if we don't address the actual issues here, restoration is not going to do much. It's going to help the local communities for sure. It will have an impact on a local scale, but on a large national, global level, will it have an impact? No, not if we're actually addressing the issues.
Mom,
So any mitigation is only mitigation, and it's only useful until we are addressing the source, right? Mitigation in nature is an intervention. It is trying to solve a problem after the problem has happened. So what do? We need to solve the problem, really.
Yes, ma'am. The analogy you drew is a very, very beautiful one. I mean, rather than looking for an alternative, look for the solution. That's what you're
Yeah,
suggesting.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So we had a few questions. Uh, there are two questions, ma'am. Like, there are two questions. Um, is the one by Satyendra Pandey.
Okay.
So okay, he's asked that sound travels faster in water, and marine life is sensible to it. Ship industries never care, or he's basically asking that the noise pollution caused by the industrial work in the oceans. So what must be done for that, and is there an impact on the marine life?
Yes, there's definitely an impact on the marine life. Just like how noise pollution is an issue on land, it is an issue underwater as well. It negatively impacts behavior and behavioral ecology of a lot of species. A lot of larger animals and marine mammals are extremely sensitive to noise. If you see dugongs and dolphins, they won't even come close to us. Forget about industrial level, even if you have a small fishing boat, they'll immediately be able to sense that noise and move away. So if you're having large scale industrial noise pollution, of course that is impacting the reproductive cycles, the feeding cycles, the normal behavior of so many marine animals. How do we solve that? I honestly don't have an answer, because these are, so again, I said earlier, we need to solve global warming, we need to solve ocean acidification and climate change. We are still looking for answers to be able to solve those things. But none of that can actually happen unless we have, commitment on a government level, on an international level. And that needs to go beyond just talking in conferences and holding webinars about it. It needs to actually be implemented, and there needs to be a really strong commitment from the government, which I'm sorry to say is not really there today.
No, I mean, as citizens, we must feel sorry, and we must actually do something about it. But I hope we all figure something out soon. Yes, ma'am. So let's head to the final question, no?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a word of advice that you would like to give to the public, the students, anything that you would want to say to all of us here.
I'm not so much older than you, so I don't know what advice you're asking for. But at least I'd like to think I'm not so much older. But if there's some kind of advice that I can give, it is don't ever think that your voice does not matter, or that what you're doing won't make a difference, right? Because the minute you become skeptical or you become cynical of like, yeah, this is what happens, this has been happening for so many years, big deal, that just means you've given up and you've become lazy, and then you can't change, you can't hope for any change anywhere, and always look towards exercising your power as a student, exercising your power as a citizen, as a consumer, and making individual changes, demanding changes from people who are meant to be implementing these changes for us, governments, corporations, things like that. So never think that your voice and your work and your efforts don't matter, and don't stop trying.
That is beautiful. I mean, that's beautiful again, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. And so we'll end the session. It's
Sure.
been a great. I mean, it's our honor and pleasure to host you here.
Thank
And
you so much for having me. And I have to
yes,
say, these questions that you guys have asked have been so fun and so interesting, and it's been very it's been my pleasure to answer them, and I hope I've done them justice, because you guys have really done a lot of your own homework.
ma'am, it's all. I mean, all of the credits go to the team because they were brainstorming, and each one of them had their own inputs.
Can you give
So,
me the names of the people in your team? It would be really nice to know who all you guys are, because
uh,
the work that you're doing is very exciting.
we have so the questions were by Manu,
Mm-hmm.
Satya, Atul, Badra,
Okay.
Inian, and Faiza.
Okay, so huge kudos to all of them and all of you guys for coming up with these very exciting questions.
Ma'am,
I
and
had a great
also,
time.
yes, ma'am, we have a fan in our team. There's Sudarshan, and he's the design head. he just loves your Instagram because the marine life, the life that you're heading towards is a very beautiful one.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Please don't be my fan and all. I'm not doing something so great.
Yes, ma'am. And
Okay.
yes, ma'am. We'll wrap up the session, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching as well, and thank you Santoshi for contacting me for this. I had a
Yes,
great time.
ma'am. Thanks a lot. Yes, ma'am.
You too. Bye.
Yes, ma'am. Bye, ma'am. Yes.